On the night of July 31, 1999, two 17-year-old girls, J.B. Beasley and her closest friend Tracie Hawlett, drove away from Dothan, Alabama, on their way to a party marking J.B.'s birthday. Somewhere along the way they got lost, and at 11:35 p.m., Tracie phoned her mother, Carol Roberts, from a payphone outside a convenience store to let her know they were finally heading home. That was the last anyone heard from them. The girls disappeared entirely, leaving behind two grieving families and a community in shock. The following morning, officers opened the trunk of the black Mazda and discovered both girls had been shot in the head. Investigators had the perpetrator's DNA from the start, but it matched nothing in their system. He had no criminal record and no entry in CODIS, causing the case to stall for 20 years. Still, both families refused to give up hope. After the 2018 capture of the Golden State Killer demonstrated that genetic genealogy could succeed where CODIS had failed, Ozark police submitted the DNA sample to Parabon Nanolabs. What came back was a name that stunned everyone connected to the case, after 2 decades of waiting. This is the story of that 2-decade silence, of a DNA sample that sat untouched for years, and of a killer who had lived quietly within the community the entire time. To understand it, we need to go back to that night. The summer of 1999 fell during one of America's most prosperous stretches. The dot-com boom was in full swing, Bill Clinton remained in office after weathering impeachment, and Backstreet Boys and TLC songs dominated the airwaves. That same summer settled over Dothan, Alabama, with the thick humidity typical of the wiregrass region in the state's southeast corner, a city of about 60,000 residents near the Florida and Georgia state lines. It was the kind of close-knit southern town where everyone knew their neighbors, and where teenagers spent their summers at backyard get-togethers and cruising the county's straight roads without a second thought about danger. J.B. Beasley was about to celebrate her 17th birthday. Born July 31, 1982, she excelled academically, belonged to the Junior Honor Society, cheered for her school, and was, by all accounts, the kind of daughter who never caused her parents worry. Her mother, Cheryl Burgoon, described her as a wonderful blessing. Beside her that night was Tracie Hawlett, her best friend since middle school. The two were nearly inseparable, rarely seen apart. That July 31st should have been a night of celebration. Around 10:05 p.m., the girls set out from Dothan in JB's black Mazda 929, heading toward an outdoor party in Headland, roughly 10 miles away. They never made it. Somewhere along the route they took a wrong turn and ended up instead in Ozark, more than 20 miles in the wrong direction from Dothan. Sometime after 11:30 p.m., their Mazda pulled into the Big Little convenience store and Chevron station on East Broad Street in Ozark. Though the store had already closed for the night, the girls were fortunate enough to encounter Marilyn Merritt and her daughter, who happened to be there. J.B. and Tracie asked for directions back to Highway 231 to find their way home. Merritt gave them clear instructions and later remembered that J.B.'s car was immaculate. The girls appeared well kept and composed, and nothing about their demeanor suggested trouble. They simply seemed like two kids anxious about getting home late. At a payphone near the store's entrance, Tracie called her mother. Carol Roberts heard nothing unusual in her daughter's voice. Tracie explained they'd gotten lost but now had directions and were heading back. Her final words before hanging up were, "Mom, I love you. Be home soon." Merritt watched from the parking lot as the black Mazda pulled out, turned right exactly as directed, and vanished into the night. It was the final time anyone would see either girl alive. The store's security camera captured a grainy image from that same window of time. A small white pickup truck sitting at the gas pump precisely when Tracie was on the phone with her mother. No purchase was logged at that pump, and nobody could identify the truck or its driver. 4 years afterward, that blurry image of the white truck would remain one of the case's most persistent unanswered questions. The next morning, August 1st, Carol Roberts and J.B.'s family reported the girls missing after they failed to return home. That same morning, someone spotted J.B.'s black Mazda parked on Herring Avenue in Ozark, under a mile from where Tracie had made her final call. When Ozark police responded, the car showed no damage, no evidence of a crash, and nothing indicating it had been run off the road. At first glance, it looked like a simple case of an abandoned vehicle. But a closer look revealed troubling details. The car was covered in mud, the tank was nearly empty, the driver's window was cracked open, and the doors were unlocked. J.B.'s license sat on the dashboard, and both girls' wallets, along with their cash, jewelry, and credit cards, remained untouched inside. The only thing missing was J.B.'s keychain, which spelled out "hard to get" in black and white lettering. Since the car carried Dothan plates, Ozark police contacted their counterparts in Dothan, and an investigator was dispatched simply to arrange for a tow. The car had already been sitting there since 8 a.m., and for 6 hours, no one thought to check the trunk. It wasn't until nearly 2 p.m., while waiting for the tow truck, that the Dothan investigator noticed an interior trunk release that didn't require a key. He opened it, and found J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett inside, each killed by a single 9mm gunshot wound to the head. Although the girls remained fully dressed with no clear signs of a physical struggle, their bodies revealed important clues. Tracie had a bullet wound to the temple, scrape marks on her arm, thorny debris clinging to her pants, and her nearly new sneakers, purchased just days earlier, were covered in mud. Both girls had wet fabric on their pant legs reaching up to the knee, indicating they'd crossed through damp grass or wet terrain before being killed. Based on how they were positioned in the trunk, Tracie had clearly been loaded in first, with JB placed on top of her. A shell casing from a 9mm weapon was found resting on Tracie's leg. Investigators quickly ruled out robbery as a motive, since money, jewelry, and cards were all left behind. It became clear the murders hadn't taken place on Herring Avenue. That location was simply where the bodies had been left. The first autopsy found no indication of sexual assault and no drugs or alcohol in their systems. However, more than 2 months later, the Alabama State Crime Lab made a discovery that reshaped the entire case. Semen was recovered from JB's underwear, bra, and skin, and an unidentified palm print was lifted from inside the trunk lid. Prosecutor David Emery, who was handling the case for Dale and Geneva counties, publicly stated the crime had a sexual dimension. He was right, but identifying the source of that DNA would take another 2 decades. The murders devastated Dothan. It wasn't a fleeting shock but one that lingered over the community, making people question everyone around them. The image of 2 teenage girls killed on a birthday night stayed seared into the region's memory. A reward fund was established, and the public demanded justice, putting significant pressure on law enforcement. Exactly 1 month after the discovery of the bodies, a local man came forward voluntarily. On September 1, 1999, Johnny William Barentine, a 28-year-old part-time mechanic living close to where the car was found, told police he had information. During a recorded 4-hour interrogation, he gave 6 different, shifting accounts of what happened. He first mentioned seeing a black truck speed away from the scene. Then he claimed he'd picked up a heavily tattooed stranger near the convenience store. In his final and most elaborate story, he said this tattooed man had gotten into the girl's car, directed him to follow to Herring Avenue, pulled the girls out, and that Barentine heard 2 shots before driving the man away afterward. Police arrested him immediately, and news coverage led the public to believe the killer had finally been caught. But the story fell apart. None of Barentine's 6 versions mentioned any sexual assault, despite physical evidence proving one had occurred. The neighbor he named as the tattooed man had a verified alibi for the entire night, and DNA testing excluded both Barentine and the neighbor as suspects. Barentine later confessed to a grand jury that his entire story had been invented in hopes of collecting the reward money. He had witnessed nothing. The grand jury chose not to indict him, and he was set free. This left investigators in a worse position than before, having burned through months and resources chasing a fabricated lead. The investigation moved on to other suspects. A man visiting from Michigan, who'd attended a nearby party that night, couldn't explain several missing hours and left the area shortly after the murders were discovered. Investigators traveled to Michigan 3 separate times to question him, but his DNA didn't match. A man from Mississippi, staying in Ozark at the time, vanished right after the killings and was also brought in for DNA testing, which also excluded him. The unexplained white truck captured on the convenience store security footage, blurry, with an illegible plate and unrecognized by locals, was never traced to an owner or driver. Each lead investigators pursued ultimately went nowhere, and every cleared suspect only deepened the mystery. The only evidence still holding potential was the killer's DNA from the semen sample, but it matched no one in Alabama's system, and the person responsible remained free and unidentified. The 2000s passed, then the 2010s. Dothan continued evolving, new neighborhoods appeared, and children born after 1999 grew up only knowing J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett's names through what adults told them. But for Carol Roberts and Cheryl Burgoon, the mothers of the 2 girls, time didn't move forward in the same way. Instead, it piled up year after year like sediment over an unhealed wound. Each July 31st, they revisited that night, the payphone call, Trace's final words, the car turning into darkness and never returning. The case technically stayed open with Ozark police, but no real progress was made. The semen sample remained preserved in the lab as the sole biological link to the killer, yet no match ever surfaced. The forensic DNA capabilities of 1999 weren't sufficient, and neither were those of 2005 or 2010. While the CODIS database expanded over the years, it only included profiles from people who had been arrested or convicted, and since the killer had no criminal record, there was no reason his DNA would ever appear in that system. The case grew into one of Alabama's most notorious unsolved crimes, resurfacing in 5-year anniversary news pieces, discussed on true crime forums, and brought up by Dothan locals whenever the summer heat rolled in and stirred memories of that July 31st night. But being remembered wasn't the same as being solved. 20 years passed without answers, without justice, only two mothers aging year after year, haunted by a single unanswered question: who killed my daughter? Then, in April 2018, nearly 2 decades after JB and Tracie vanished, the nation's attention turned to a major arrest in California. Joseph James DeAngelo, the so-called Golden State Killer responsible for at least 13 murders and over 50 sexual assaults during the 1970s and 80s, was finally apprehended after 4 decades of evading capture, thanks to a groundbreaking method never before applied in American law enforcement: genetic genealogy. Rather than searching for a suspect's DNA in criminal databases, which only hold profiles of people with prior arrests, investigators uploaded crime scene DNA to public genealogy platforms like GEDmatch, where ordinary people had voluntarily submitted their own DNA to trace their ancestry and locate relatives. Using partial matches from these sites, investigators constructed family trees, working from distant relations toward closer ones until they zeroed in on one specific person matching every criterion. In essence, the technique located the killer's relatives first, then used that network to identify the individual himself. Ozark Police Chief Mosley Walker watched the DeAngelo case unfold with more personal investment than most in law enforcement, because it reminded him of a file sitting in his own department, a semen sample that had waited nearly 20 years without producing a match, tied to 2 teenage girls who'd never received justice and 2 mothers still waiting for answers. He reached out to Parabon Nanolabs, the same company instrumental in identifying DeAngelo, and asked them to run the 1999 crime scene DNA through GEDmatch, locate related families in Alabama, and build out family trees to narrow down a suspect. Parabon agreed and conducted the analysis, returning a list of Alabama families whose DNA resembled the sample. Scanning that list, Walker's eyes landed on one name he recognized from his own school years: Coley McCraney. McCraney was 45, a lifelong resident of the Dothan, Ozark area, working as a long-haul truck driver and serving as a pastor at a local church, married to Jeanette with 2 children. He had no criminal history whatsoever, and nothing over the previous 20 years had ever connected his name to the murders. Within the community, he was well-liked and respected, someone people chatted with easily, a man his congregation admired. Ask anyone in town about him, and they'd have only positive things to say. That reputation was precisely why his DNA had never appeared in any criminal database. Walker approached the situation carefully, avoiding treating McCraney as a suspect outright, since that risk could prompt him to lawyer up or flee. Instead, he framed it as a routine request to a longtime acquaintance, someone he'd known since high school, simply asking for help identifying the actual culprit. Walker was direct with him: "You are not a suspect, but I need your DNA so we can identify the person we're really looking for." McCraney's wife Jeanette, present for the conversation, encouraged her husband to cooperate, seeing no reason for concern. He agreed, sitting calmly as an officer collected a cheek swab, unaware that the genetic genealogy work had already pointed investigators directly to him before he'd even entered the building. When results came back, they left no ambiguity. McCraney's DNA was an exact match to the semen sample recovered from J.B. Beasley's body back in 1999. Confronted with this evidence, McCraney denied any involvement, claiming he'd never known either girl and wasn't even in Ozark that night. On March 15, 2019, almost exactly 20 years after the girls disappeared, Coley McCraney was arrested on multiple charges of capital murder and rape, with prosecutors announcing they'd pursue the death penalty. The arrest sent shockwaves through Dothan and Ozark, but the disbelief wasn't about the case finally being cracked after 2 decades, nor about DNA science succeeding where traditional detective work had failed for years. It was about the name itself: Coley McCraney, a pastor, a father, a truck driver whom countless community members knew personally, greeted on the street, sat beside in church pews, or chatted with about everyday things like football or weather. In 20 years of investigation, not a single person, not even police, had ever considered him a possibility. It wasn't simple shock, it was the dawning, painful realization that the man responsible had spent 2 decades living an ordinary life within the very community he'd wronged, working, worshiping, raising a family, growing older, while Carol Roberts and Cheryl Burgoon waited helplessly for answers. When Carol Roberts learned of the arrest, she was left speechless for several minutes. Cheryl Burgoon broke down in tears. Both women had spent 20 years anticipating this moment, yet its arrival brought no true relief or closure, only old grief resurfacing alongside fresh hope that the coming trial would finally deliver the answers they'd waited so long to hear. The trial had been scheduled for 2020, but the COVID-19 pandemic brought everything to a halt. The trial didn't actually begin until April 2023, 24 years after JB and Tracie were murdered on Herring Avenue, opening in Dale County under Judge William Fillmore. By then, Coley McCraney was 49 and facing 4 capital murder charges plus 1 rape charge. Proceedings stretched across 8 days, filled with numerous witnesses, forensic evidence, and fierce arguments from both sides. Carol Roberts and Cheryl Burgoon sat together in the section reserved for victims' families throughout. In a bold and risky move, McCraney chose to testify in his own defense, a decision that exposes any defendant to unshielded cross-examination from prosecutors. His account this time bore no resemblance to his flat denial back in 2019. Now he claimed he'd first met JB months earlier at a Dothan mall, where she'd introduced herself as Jennifer. According to him, they'd exchanged numbers, kept talking, and arranged to meet up in Ozark on July 31st. He testified that his truck had broken down that night due to a faulty alternator, and that he happened to spot JB and Tracie near the payphone, approached them, and they'd offered to drive him to his truck. He claimed he and JB had consensual sex inside his truck's cab, after which the girls dropped him off around 12:45 a.m., and that he had no idea what happened to them afterward. When asked why he'd flatly denied even knowing the girls back in 2019, he said he'd been afraid of his wife discovering his infidelity. Prosecutors methodically took apart his entire account. No texts, calls, witnesses, or any other evidence supported the claim that he and JB had any prior relationship. Marilyn Merritt, who'd encountered the girls at the convenience store that night, testified plainly that the girls had simply been lost and asking for directions home. Nothing suggested a planned rendezvous. Tracie's 11:35 p.m. call to her mother reinforced this, confirming they were heading home, not to meet anyone. Using forensic and physical evidence, prosecutors reconstructed what actually happened. After leaving the convenience store, McCraney approached the girls' car, forced them at gunpoint to another location, one with brush and wet ground, explaining the mud and dampness on their clothes and shoes, raped JB, shot both girls with a 9mm handgun, loaded their bodies into the trunk, then drove the car to Herring Avenue and abandoned it there. But perhaps the trial's most pivotal witness was Jeanette McCraney, the defendant's own wife, the same woman who'd sat beside him in 2019, urging him to cooperate with police because she'd had no reason to doubt him. On the stand, she testified that her husband had left home on the night of July 31, 1999, and had been gone for a stretch of time he'd never adequately explained. Her testimony, coming from a woman who had unwittingly helped investigators secure her husband's DNA, who had trusted him for 2 decades, and who was now testifying against him, stood out as one of the trial's most gut-wrenching moments. Deliberations began on April 25, 2023, and by April 26, the jury delivered its verdict, guilty on all 4 counts. This included JB's murder during the commission of rape, Tracie's murder occurring alongside JB's during that same criminal episode, both murders happening within a single continuous act, and the use of JB's Mazda 929 in furtherance of the crime. Under Alabama law, using a victim's own vehicle during a crime elevates the offense to capital murder, a provision meant to carry the most severe punishment available. The next day, jurors reconvened to determine sentencing, ultimately choosing life imprisonment without parole rather than the death penalty prosecutors had sought. Regardless, at 49, McCraney would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. When the verdict was announced, Carol Roberts sat in stunned silence for several minutes before later remarking that after 24 years of waiting, someone was finally being held responsible. Cheryl Burgoon reportedly leaned forward and wept uncontrollably upon hearing the word guilty. Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall, who prosecuted the case personally, addressed reporters afterward, expressing sorrow over the loss of 2 young girls who never got the chance to grow up. He acknowledged that no verdict could offer complete closure, but it did finally answer the question both families had carried unanswered for 24 years. McCraney is now serving his sentence at William E. Donaldson Correctional Facility in Bessemer, Alabama. In a phone interview with ABC News from prison, he maintained his innocence, saying people were free to call him unfaithful or a cheater, but insisting he hadn't killed anyone. This case became one of the earliest in the U.S. to demonstrate genetic genealogy's power to crack cold cases that had defeated every conventional investigative approach, cases with no criminal record, no dependable witnesses, and no evidence beyond a single DNA sample sitting in storage for 2 decades. Following McCraney's conviction, Hundreds of similar cold cases nationwide were reopened using the same technology, giving families who'd long abandoned hope the phone calls they'd stopped expecting. Each resolved case meant another family finally freed from decades of unanswered questions. The story of J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett also leaves behind practical takeaways relevant to everyday safety, particularly for parents and young people. Chief among them, always share detailed plans before heading out, not a vague "I'm going to a party," but the specific address, the host's name, contact information, and an expected return time. Whenever plans shift, reach out right away with an update, just as Tracie did when she phoned her mother from Ozark. Had there been one more person aware of exactly where the girls were and what they were doing, the outcome might have been entirely different. Second, given how accessible smartphones are today, no one should ever be lost without someone else knowing. Enable real-time location sharing with at least one trusted family member whenever traveling somewhere unfamiliar or far from home, particularly after dark. Third, if you or your child ends up stranded in an isolated area at night, remain inside the vehicle with the doors locked and call for help rather than getting out to ask strangers for directions, if at all avoidable. Fourth, listen to your gut. If something feels wrong, even without a clear reason why, leave the area, contact emergency services, or head toward a populated location. Finally, this case serves as a reminder that dangerous individuals rarely look the part. They can be a neighbor, a familiar face in your community, someone you've encountered countless times without a hint of suspicion. Staying alert isn't the same as being paranoid, it's a habit that can genuinely save a life. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing and sharing it so accounts like this one continue reaching people, since every share might be what helps someone find their way home safely. Thanks for watching all the way through, and see you in the next one.